In the past, army officials deemed women incapable of great feats. But one young French woman was inspired by the divine, and her story will never be forgotten. Hello storyticians. Today we'll dive into the story of Joan of Arc. Historically, women have always been underestimated, but this woman taught everyone how wrong they were. In the early 15th century, there was a war taking place between England and France. Such a war is now known as the 100 Years' War. In the middle of this crisis, there was a young country woman, born in a small village in the east of France called DOMREMY. She was raised in a poor family that was dedicated to farming. Every day, Joan worked on her family's farm with domestic activities and animal care. She grew to be smart, hardworking and kind, but she never went far from her little home. Joan was living in a kind of bubble, but too close to the ongoing raging war with the English and the Burgundians. Also, at the time, there was a dispute for the French crown. French monarch and heir to the throne, Charles, wanted to leverage his power and following to become king. Around this time, Joan of Arc started to experience mystical visions that became more and more vivid and demanding with time. With time, she started envisioning that God and different saints were designating her as the savior of France. She was told to seek an audience with Charles, the heir to the throne, and ask him his permission to lead the French army into battle with the English, to expel them and install Charles as the rightful king. After hearing the message clearly, Joan agreed to accomplish what her visions were telling her to do. She was to seek the French monarch and convince him of this mission. So Joan started her journey while she was only 17 years old. She started seeking help from many, but few paid her attention. She managed to win the favor of some men who felt their conviction. They could see that she was completely sure of what had to be done and how. Little by little, through the conviction in her eyes, in her words, and her actions, she managed to convince a handful of soldiers. Between them stood the official that she was told of in her visions, a loyal man to Charles, someone who could take her to the future king. Joan, dressed in men's uniform and accompanied by 6 men-at-arms, crossed enemy territory in a long journey. After weeks of traveling, they managed to reach Chinon, where the heir to the throne was located. By that time, Charles was already aware that there was an extremely young woman who claimed to have mystical visions, and that she had a mission to expel the English and give him his throne. Charles was full of doubts, but certainly interested in what this woman had to say. His counselors couldn't agree on what he should do. Some said he should hear her out, and others disagreed. The heir to the throne came up with an ingenious plan. He wanted to reassure himself and his counselors that this woman had a connection with the divine. With this in mind, he accepted to see her, but he was going to secretly hide within his many courtiers. Someone else would be dressed as a prince, and he would be disguised as a courtier. Nevertheless, Joan was quick to realize what was happening and to identify the king. In no time, she managed to convince Prince Charles. He allowed the young teenager to lead his army into battle to defeat the English in Orleans. Joan led the march with a large group of men, but when they arrived, they encountered the city surrounded by the English army. The young commander was told to wait until reinforcements arrived. On May the 4th of 1429, while they were waiting for reinforcements and Joan was laying down and resting, it is said that she suddenly sprang up and announced that they had to attack immediately. She armed herself and hurried to an English fort where she encountered an ongoing raid. The arrival of Joan of Arc empowered the soldiers and they took the fort. In the following days, Joan and her army managed to continue their advance. They marched to the next fort and took it in record time. The English wanted to retreat and regroup, but many didn't have the time to do so. They advanced to the next fort, Les Truelles, where Joan was wounded, but she quickly recovered and returned to the battlefield. She made an example for every other commander and soldier to follow. They would fight to the death or victory. The advance continues until they liberated Orleans and the English retreated. The French were exuberant. This sent a very clear message. The English were not invincible. On the contrary, they were vulnerable. Even more so when they had the great Joan of Arc and God on their side. With this momentum, they continued their fight to defeat the English. Yet, although Joan had done everything she had promised, Charles and many of his advisors still didn't trust her. She had earned the favor of many, but that was another reason why she shouldn't be trusted. Joan insisted time and time again that they should take Reims and earn Charles's so coveted crown, and probably attack Paris afterwards. Charles never agreed to such a proposal from Joan, but she kept leading armies into a large stream of victories. She was acclaimed throughout France. The heir to the throne was able to earn his coronation, hugely thanks to what Joan was accomplishing. But the battle continued. Although many of the villages around Paris were already surrendering to the king, there was a lot to do still. Joan was becoming even more impatient. She was completely sure that taking Paris was the next thing they should do. Finally, the new King Charles arrived and launched an attack on Paris. The Parisians were ready, but they knew Joan of Arc was between their sieges. They were terrified by her presence. She was wounded in battle, but still stood in front of the army and yelled at the Parisians to surrender. Their siege wasn't successful, and King Charles ordered a retreat. The battle wasn't over. Joan was constantly sent to different towns, villages, and cities. Most of them succumbed to the armies she led. After one of her missions, she was returning to Compiègne, north of Paris. She heard that the city was under siege, so she made a secret entrance in the middle of the night to fight in its defense. This wasn't enough though. The English managed to make the French retreat. Always so brave, Joan was defending the rear guard when she was unhorsed and then captured. She was taken to the king of the Burgundians. When apprehended, she was accused by her people of acting against what the council had stated and willingly making the army lose that battle. King Charles was working on a truce with the Burgundian king, and so he made no attempt to rescue Joan. Afterward, she was claimed for judgment by French religious who paid 10,000 francs to judge her. They had turned to the English side. They built a castle to execute her for a heretic because of her claims of directly communicating with God himself. They would also discredit King Charles in the process because he would have earned his coronation through a heretic. She was skillful to evade so many of their accusations, and she also had the loyalty of many people around the country. One trial followed another one. Powerful people wanted to see her dead. After many processes, most of which were completely corrupted, she was finally sentenced to death. Joan of Arc was burned alive, still professing what she had lived and fought for. She had real visions and died following the mission God had set her for. Decades later, her case was revisited and her sentence was annulled. Some centuries later, in 1920, Pope Benedict XV canonized Joan of Arc. Ever since her heroic actions, once living as a humble and poor little girl, Joan changed the course of her people and history as a whole. She has become a symbol of the French people and an inspiration for many around the world. War is a trial for the people involved, and Joan of Arc proved to be an out-of-this-world woman, soldier, patriot, and Christian. Was Joan of Arc able to lead the French army to victory because she was inspired by God? What do you think? If you are already looking for another story, we invite you to listen to this one. The Day We Realized Computers Could Beat Us. True short story. Click on this card to watch that now. If you enjoy our stories, consider becoming a storytician by subscribing to this channel. Now, go and live the most inspiring of all stories. The story of your life.